All right, guys, I'm back. Did you miss me? Be honest. We're back, guys. We're back. It's season two. I am so excited to be recording and releasing again. It's been a well needed break for me. I really needed to take some time off. Podcasting is actually really not something that you can pause. And so, if anybody has ever tried to start a podcast before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But it's something that is just ongoing all the time. So, being able to take a little bit of a break, I really enjoyed that. It gave me some time to kind of recalibrate and think about season two. So, here we are, guys. Season two, we are back. We are going to continue on with Robert's story. Last we left off is when he got onto the plane to America. But before we get into Robert's continuation, I actually wanted to start off season two with some special guests. Today, I am starting off the season and kicking it off with a reporter, or so called a stringer, who was at the Khmer Rouge camps and was reporting on what was going on at the time. This was a really cool experience for me. First time that I'd ever interviewed anybody that wasn't my father. And I had so much fun doing it. I think this will give you guys a whole extra layer of context of what kind of really life was like back in Cambodia, what was going on as everybody was swarming out of the country. And I wanted to share it with you all. And let me tell you, John is legitimate. He was a writer for the Time magazine and the Washington Post at the time. I could not believe that he reached out to me through email saying that he listened to the podcast and he mentioned that he was actually there and he talked a little bit about his connection. And I was like, I have to have you on the podcast because I bet you everybody would want to hear what that third party perspective would be like. So, yes, welcome to season two. I before we even kind of get back to Robert's story, this is a really cool episode that I want to kick off the season with. So, I hope you guys enjoy. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. Season two is upon us, and I am kicking it off with a very special guest. Today, here we have a man named John Burgess. He was a stringer for the Time magazine and the Washington Post from 1979 to the 1980s, covering on the ground exactly what had happened in these Cambodian refugee camps. He had his firsthand experience on the grounds of the camps, witnessing everything going on from the starving people marching out of the forests to being there the day of First Lady Carter and when she visited in November of 1979. So when he reached out, I could not pass up the opportunity to pick his brain and give all the listeners an inside scoop of exactly what his experience was like. So thank you, John, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm so excited. We have a whole bunch of questions that we want to dive into. So before we kind of get into the nitty gritty, why don't we start off with how did you become a freelance writer for the crisis during this time in 1979?
Mm-hmm. Well, I had lived in Thailand as a high school student in the 1960s and then went back there in the 70s and got a start in journalism. So when this crisis broke out, I was living in Hong Kong with my wife and got an offer. Would I go back to Thailand and cover this amazing news story for the Washington Post and for Time magazine? So I was sort of the low cost solution to this problem, in that normally a full staff correspondent would go, which would cost a lot more money. But anyway, this opportunity came, and we moved from Hong Kong to Thailand to to cover this amazing event. And my wife actually ended up working for the UN refugee program.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So, and for everybody who doesn't know what a stringer is, I know I mentioned that terminology. It is a freelance writer. Somebody, can you kind of explain for everybody what a stringer really is?
Sure. It means a part-time correspondent, and the word stringer comes from the old days when what you were paid uh, was measured by how long a string was, how many column inches, measuring the stories that you produce. So you were literally paid by the inch as measured by a string.
Oh,
But it
wow.
normally means you have some kind of arrangement with that news organization that they can call on you when they need you.
Okay. Okay. So, in total, so you moved out to Thailand and you were
Uh-huh.
living in, I believe, Bangkok at the time, right,
That's
Sean?
right.
Okay. How many days in total would you say you were covering this story for?
Sure. I would say, I was there over the course of more than a year, about 15 months, but I would say I spent probably 30 or 40 days on the ground in these places.
Okay. And then when you got there, did you kind of have an idea of what was going on when they called you on this project? And when you got there, was it what you expected?
Uh, the answer is absolutely not. No one had any idea of what they were about to witness as journalists. We arrived in Bangkok in August or September of '79, and I started going up to the border to see what I could see. There were sort of rumors in Bangkok of huge numbers of Cambodians moving toward the border and crossing into Thailand. The Thai army had sort of sealed off large parts of the border, so you weren't able just to come and go as you wanted. You had to get permission.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But in no way was I prepared for what was coming in the next year.
Yeah, yeah. I would imagine that's the same sentiment for many of the people who covered it.
Uh, I think so.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, what were some of your challenges? You mentioned a little bit about just now about not having permission everywhere. What areas did you cover exactly, first of all, and what were some of the challenges in covering that?
Sure. Well, most of the reporting I did was near the Thai border town of Aranyaprathet.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, and refugees came across the border north of Aranyaprathet and south of Aranyaprathet. So, one, we had the challenge of getting access, being actually to go in and see with our own eyes and talk to people on our own. And it literally changed day by day. Sometimes the Thai army was very restrictive, and sometimes you were free to come and go. Another issue was language. I had
Mm-hmm.
studied Thai for a long time, so I was always looking for Cambodians who spoke Thai, and there are a few of them. But for the most part, it was difficult to communicate with people. And the other one was personal security. You never knew exactly where you were going and what you were going to run into when you went around a corner on on a trail crossing rice fields. So uh, I would typically go up there 2 or 3 days at a time, and spend the nights in Aranyaprathet, and then go back out and see what I could see. Then go back to Bangkok and file. And this was before the days of cell phones, when you could
Mm-hmm.
when you could file without any trouble from essentially any place on the globe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would imagine when you're going there, and other people that I've spoke to who have been there firsthand had mentioned this kind of interesting dynamic between whether it be political or emotional, between the Thais versus the organizations and the refugees. Or what did you notice was kind of the dynamics between everybody at that time?
Sure. Well, the Thais were already hosting tens of thousands of refugees from Laos. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and they were in long-term camps, mostly in the northeast of Thailand. And basically, the Thai government's position is we do not want another huge refugee population crossing into our territory and staying forever. And so, in the beginning, the Thai position was we'll let people come in for a little while, but they've got to go back. This is not an open border,
Right, right.
and uh, they obviously that's a different position than the UN Refugee Program and international NGOs would take. That they would want to go in and deliver food and medical care and make life easier for these people who were in very serious trauma. Over time, the Thais relented and allowed large numbers of Cambodians to come in and to uh, to live at a newly created camp called Kauridang,
Mm-hmm.
and there to undergo immigration interviews and placement for travel onward to third countries. But it was only with the express promise of foreign governments that people would be settled, that they would be supported materially, that they wouldn't cost Thailand money. And actually, toward the end, uh, conditions were sufficiently good in Kauidang camp in terms of nutrition and medical care that the Thai government actually required NGOs who wanted to work there to also provide services to ordinary Thai villages in
Mm-hmm.
that part of the country. And so typically an NGO had to make that pledge to divide their work between Cambodians and Thais.
So by the time you got there, you would say the camps had already started getting a lot of help, or were you? I think you were there from what was the month you were there, John? From the very beginning?
Well, I arrived in September, and the big influx of people began in October. And
Okay.
so when I got there, there was basically nothing on
Mm-hmm.
the border camps. Uh, People were crossing and literally setting up camp, in the middle of a forest, in the middle of a
Mm-hmm.
rice field,
Mm-hmm.
and just camping out there and hoping that they could go in further, maybe be resettled in a third country, or at least escape the danger and the disease and the food shortages that were ravaging Cambodia in the interior. So in a number of cases, I witnessed groups of thousands of people crossing into Thailand and just setting up camp and hoping for whatever came next. And then as there was international media coverage of this, there began to be a mobilization around the world, actually quite fast, that there's a huge humanitarian crisis going on, and NGOs from all over the world came in and were seeking permission to go and provide these essential services.
Yeah, I'm really really fascinated that you were actually able to witness from as a third party person the march of people coming out and flooding
Yeah.
out of these forests. Can you kind of walk us through, was it a particular day or was it something you just noticed over time? Can you walk us through what you saw?
Well, I can recall very well the first time that I saw it,
Right.
which was, I would say, in early October of 1979.
Mm-hmm.
I had gone with a Time magazine correspondent up to the border, and we were sitting in a Thai military camp trying to get permission to go in, talking to an officer, and one of his aides came in and said, "Oh, 10 Cambodians have crossed the border at such and such village." And we thought, "Oh, that's very interesting." And 5 minutes later, he came in and said, "No, it's 100 Cambodians." And then literally 5 minutes after that, he said 1,000. So we said, "We want to go and see this." And we got in our car and drove the 10 or 15 miles, whatever it was. And suddenly we were just totally shocked to come across this scene of a mammoth parade of Cambodians walking along the highway, uh, carrying bags of rice, carrying cooking pots, carrying children, many of them in terrible, terrible physical condition. You could look at them and tell that they were almost ready to fall down. There were people on crutches, and they were sort of being shepherded along this road by Thai soldiers and led to a field down the road where basically they just collapsed onto the dirt and wondered what was going to come next. And you know, as it went along, we discovered the circumstances here. And this was a group of people who had come out from a Khmer Rouge controlled pocket right up against the Thai border, and they had been under pressure from the Army of Vietnam, which had invaded Cambodia, 8 months, 9 months earlier.
Right.
And with that, this was basically a group of Khmer Rouge soldiers, and with them, a bunch of large numbers of civilians whom they had essentially enslaved and brought along with them when they retreated from the Vietnamese. And these people were still under the control of the Khmer Rouge. And you could see it before your eyes, Khmer Rouge cadre walking around this camp and giving orders here, giving orders there. And many of these people approached journalists and said, please, can you help me get out of here? I want to go to a place that's not controlled by the Khmer Rouge. So
Wow.
it was a heartbreaking scene in that there were a lot of young men with them. And these young men were clearly soldiers, and they were in good health. They were well fed. They didn't seem sick, and that was evidence that this was the priority that was going on in these Khmer Rouge zones, that we feed the fighters who can fight against the Vietnamese, and everybody else we don't have to worry about. So that meant starvation, disease, you name it. And these people were in terrible, terrible condition. So that was actually my very first experience with what this story was going to mean.
Wow. And how did it feel once you witnessed that? Did you feel a greater sense of responsibility for covering what you needed to cover?
Well, I'd say I had two reactions, and one was, as a journalist, what an amazing story! I have to get in there and find out what's going on,
Mm-hmm, right.
and write something and let the world know what's going on here. Indeed, our media coverage was helped to drive humanitarian aid to these places. It happens all over the world that the media will start reporting that there's a real problem somewhere, and NGOs and UN agencies follow that. But at the same time, you couldn't witness this kind of thing without feeling some kind of personal involvement and personal empathy. And people would approach you, and they assumed that you, as a white foreigner,
Right.
You must be some kind of a doctor. You must know things. You must have food. You must be able to help them. And of course, I didn't know the first thing about treating diseases like this.
Right.
And after a while, what I did was I bought giant jars of vitamin pills in Aranya Patet. And you could go into a pharmacy there and buy a big, big jar of vitamin pills with 1,000 pills.
Wow.
Or something. And this was the only thing that I could give to people. And so I would, sometimes when I walked around these places, that was the thing I could give them. I knew you can't really hurt yourself taking two vitamins, but I would try to leave instructions, make them understand one of these today, only one. You won't get better by taking 10. But that was sort of my my way of sort of stepping outside of my journalistic role. And then after a few months, a few weeks even, people who really knew what they were doing, doctors and nurses and emergency medical teams were on the scene, and I didn't need to do that anymore.
That's incredible. I think just wow. I think it's amazing that you were able to witness that and really see that. And you mentioned, people looking at you as a white foreigner, as you must know something. Did that happen everywhere you went? Every time you walked around, was it common for people to ask you, like, I need help, I need help?
Well, yes, it did. It did happen.
Right.
It did happen quite a bit. In one sense, these people had been inside Cambodia for the last 4 years and somehow surviving under Khmer Rouge rule at a time when there were no white foreigners in Cambodia.
Right.
And seeing someone like me, in some cases, would set off the light bulb in people's, where they're saying, wow, maybe things are going to go back to normal.
Right.
Maybe life will return somewhat to what it used to be. That was one reaction, and another reaction was just to look right past you and there was sometimes when I felt I was a ghost wandering around.
Right.
Because nobody paid any attention to me, and I could raise a camera and take pictures, and no one would bat an eyelash
right.
about it. So there was these two very different reactions.
Right. Right. I'm also very curious, too. You mentioned about having to get permission. Getting permission. If you need water, you can get some. No worries.
No, I'm
fine. If you having to get permission from the Thais to cover media, right. What did that permission mean? Did you have restrictions on what you can take pictures of or couldn't take, or what did that mean?
Generally, it just meant that they gave you a piece of paper and you had to go through Thai military roadblocks to get to the border. So you whipped out this piece of paper and showed it to the soldiers, and they would let you through.
Okay.
But once you were there, you were free to wander around and talk to anyone you wanted and essentially do anything you wanted. So
okay.
It was really just sort of a geographical place restriction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And were there any other writers around you, John, or were you kind of the only one there, or from what you knew of?
No, there were other people like me, stringers from Bangkok, and I would often travel with another foreign journalist. We would split expenses and rent a car jointly, and I think also you felt a little bit better being there with a second person, right. in case there was some kind of trouble. So it blew hot and cold. Sometimes full correspondents and TV crews would come in, and I would when a full correspondent from Time or the Washington Post came, my role then became gopher, facilitator, interpreter. And I generally wasn't writing my own stories; they were writing the stories.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But yeah, there were. I was not the only person in this place.
So, can you recall an instance, John, where you felt like you were risking your life to kind of capture a story that you saw or followed?
Yeah. Well, generally speaking, I did not feel in danger going into these places. Generally speaking, there wasn't fighting going on most of the time, and you could drive around. But there was one incident that I do remember, in which a fellow journalist, a guy named John Macbeth, who worked for the Far Eastern Economic Review, we were driving up and down the border in this area where the Khmer Rouge groups had come across. And the situation was in such flux. People moving around. A camp is here on one day, and then the next day it's gone. we were just sort of trying to scope out what was happening. And we got out of the car and we walked down a trail towards Cambodia. And this is an area where the border is not clearly marked, and you never really know, are you in Thailand? Are you in Cambodia? We walked a while, and suddenly we rounded a corner, and there was an armed squad of Khmer Rouge soldiers taking a break along this trail. Maybe 20 people. They were all sitting down and just resting. And we said, "Oh my God, how did this happen? We didn't
My
intend
goodness.
this." And then there was a terrific outbreak of gunfire from somewhere beyond us. It sounded very, very close, but it probably wasn't that far. It probably wasn't that close. I mean, and the commander of these soldiers turned out to be quite friendly, and he spoke some Thai. And we went up and we were basically doing a quick interview with him, and he was telling us about how his men had killed 2 Vietnamese the day before, and uh, uh, we did that for a few minutes, and then we thought, this is not the place to be. We better get out of here. So we just turned around and walked back down down that trail, came back to our car, which was just sitting there waiting for us, and drove away. There were a couple of other incidents. Once when there was sort of some limited fighting between the Thai army and the Vietnamese army, and we were standing at the intersection of 2 roads, and mortar rounds started landing around us, apparently fired by the Vietnamese. So we ran and took shelter under a bridge that was right nearby. But generally, you get to have a sense in these situations of danger. And there were many times when we would either hear about trouble or we could sense danger. And so we would say, far enough, we're not going down this road. We're going to turn around and go back. But that running into those Khmer Rouge soldiers was an experience I will never forget. And during the 1970 to 75 war in Cambodia, if you, as a foreign journalist, ever came into the hands of Khmer Rouge soldiers, that was the end of you, basically.
Right.
You would never be heard from again. And the geopolitics of the situation flipped by 180 degrees overnight when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia in 1978 to overthrow the Khmer Rouge. And suddenly, the Khmer Rouge were viewing people like me as allies. And they felt that the whole world was on their side against the Vietnamese. So it could be very creepy talking to these people who would treat you like an ally, like a friend suddenly. And a few years earlier, they would have murdered you.
Right. I bet you must have been scared. You had to have been scared.
Well, that situation. But there were plenty of other times when I talked to Khmer Rouge in non-violent situations like that, in camps that they were running and where nothing was going on. And again, you always had this very creepy feeling that who knows what is the history of this person,
right.
The personal history of that person that I'm talking to. What crimes might he have committed? And here he is, talking affably with you.
Right. You mentioned interview with the Khmer Rouge soldier. It wasn't an actual interview where you were able to take down notes and whatever. What were some of the questions you had asked him?
Well, I can't quite remember. I think we probably only talked with 5 minutes. I mean, we were crouching and we went up to him and said, "What's going on? What's going on?" And
right.
And he started talking about what was going on. I remember we heard weapons nearby, and he was sort of identifying whose weapon that was. And he said, we hear kaboom, and he says, "That's a 60 millimeter mortar, one of ours." So I don't know if we took notes or when we got back to the car, we sort of just reconstructed what we could remember, but it was certainly not your formal set piece interview.
No, I can imagine people being some people being really sensitive because you were walking around with a camera, weren't you, John?
Yeah, and I wish I did not take any pictures of those guys, and I wish I had tried to,
I
and
don't
I don't know whether it was because I couldn't, I forgot about the camera, or because you're right. In a military situation, soldiers they don't like cameras, and when a camera comes up, they think, oh, this person is a spy. This person is
right.
committing. We cannot allow ourselves to be photographed. So that may have been going through my head.
Or just the fact that you were in the presence of a Khmer Rouge soldier. I mean, I don't
Yeah,
blame
yeah,
you.
that's more likely that I just didn't think to do it.
My first reaction would probably be to get the heck out of here, not to take a camera out.
Yeah.
But in other instances as well, I mean, you did walk around with a camera. I mean, can you talk a little bit about whether or not you had some resistance in terms of content that you can take or not because of the dynamics?
Yeah, I would say generally in all the other situations, I took a lot of pictures. I took hundreds of photographs
Mm-hmm.
in this period, and in some cases, I was talking earlier about how the presence of a white foreigner meant maybe life is going back to normal. Often, when you would raise a camera, people would smile.
Wow.
The normal reaction when a camera comes up, and as a journalist, generally you don't want people looking at the camera when you take a picture
Right. You want it
because then the
natural.
camera looks the photo looks kind of staged, and you
Right.
prefer if people are going about their business without looking at the lens of the camera. But often people would smile, would laugh, would come around, and and kids would strike funny poses and that kind of thing. But in other places, I photographed some horrendous situations of starvation and disease, and in those, I felt I'm intruding on this person's privacy, but this photograph will truly send a powerful message to the outside world. And in those cases where people were so sick that they were hardly responding, they barely noticed me. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
that they noticed me at all. Uh,
Yes, and for those listeners, John had so graciously sent me some of his photos that he had dug up in his attic, and he had sent to me digitally, which I will be sharing with some of you guys by his permission. So thank you for
sure,
that.
sure.
Um, Next topic I want to dive into is the day of First Lady Carter's visit. So, for all the listeners, John was actually was there on the day of her visit. And I'd love to just get into the day of. So, can you walk us through that day? I mean, I don't think there's anybody I know who had been on there so close to her on the day of. What was that day like?
Sure. It was a very brief visit, just a day or two. She flew into Bangkok and then flew up to the border, landed. She was flown up by the Thai government and landed at a Thai military base near the border. And I have to tell you, it was something of a circus because basically the White House press corps had come along with her. There were roughly 150 journalists tagging along for this visit by Rosalind Carter.
Oh, wow.
And so it was a sort of, media pool kind of situation. Uh, and so I guess we had our own separate airplane that, flew following her airplane. And then there were buses out to the camp. And Rosalind Carter and her husband are people with good hearts. They're politicians, but you can detect that there's something genuine about their empathy. And she was essentially visiting this place to sort of signal to the world, and I'm sure what was going on. And I'm sure people back in the White House had sort of calculated that if Rosalind Carter went and saw with her own eyes what was going on, this would help even more, to mobilize the world. So she arrived. She went into this squalid camp where the Khmer Rouge and prisoners had been moved a few weeks earlier. The people I was just talking about who were at the border,
Mm-hmm.
after a while, they were all bused to this newly established camp, maybe 30 miles inside Thailand, and again, just left there on their own by now supplies and NGOs were coming in. It was a horrible place, the Sakao camp it was called, and the Khmer Rouge were still in charge of these people. And it had a hospital where people were dying daily in large numbers of dysentery, malaria, all these
Mm-hmm.
easily controlled diseases. So Rosalind Carter actually walked through that camp, and my memory is that I was, since all 150 people couldn't come, there was a pool of people who were allowed to go inside this hospital, which was basically a field hospital, a giant tent
Right.
with beds set up. And Rosalind Carter walked and tried to interact with different people who were in the beds. And at one point, she took up a spoon and sort of spoon fed a patient in bed. I can't remember, was it a man or a woman or a child? But anyway, she really did get right very close to this. Uh, so she was there, I would say, an hour, 2 hours, something like that. Then she got back in her plane and flew to a camp of Laotian refugees. I mentioned them earlier, and I'm
Right.
sure the Thais probably insisted that she go to the place, the Laotian camp, to show the world that there's also this huge population of Laotian refugees in in Thailand. And after that, she went and had an audience with the king and the queen. And so
Mm.
I don't know if she was on the ground more than 24 hours or what, but it was it was part of an effort to bring the world's attention to this incredible crisis that was going on. And she spoke to us journalists a little bit after and said she was overwhelmed. She had never seen anything like it. But whenever you're dealing with someone in the White House, there's a limit as to how close you actually get and how much time you actually spend with them.
Right. Do you think I mean, do you believe the Americans at home really understood the urgency of what was happening at the borders?
Well, I mean, the typical American did not, but people who follow foreign affairs, there was a period for about 2 weeks when this was on the front page day after day.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the stories that I wrote for the Washington Post were on the front page. So uh, people who paid attention to this kind of thing, and Congress and the White House and this international aid community, they were very much aware of it. But I would doubt that it penetrated very far beyond that. The Vietnam War had been over for the previous 5 years, 4 years, and and American public opinion had moved on.
Mm-hmm. So I would assume then Miss Carter's visit to Cambodia really kind of reopened the eyes to everybody. What do you think? What do you think was her impact of her visit to Cambodia?
Yeah, well, I wasn't I wasn't back in Washington, but my
Right.
memory is that her visit, which got a lot of media coverage, and the sort of independent media stories, uh, uh, helped sort of mobilize aid dollars,
Mm-hmm.
and helped bring organizations from all over the world and supplies into Thailand. And uh, around this time, a sort of understanding was reached between Thailand and UNHCR and foreign governments that foreign foreign money would support these people, and there would be a very deliberate and expedited effort to interview and fly away those people who were going to resettle abroad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I can imagine. once the wife of the U.S. president is there at on the grounds, it must be
Hmm.
a really really big deal. We have to get more money and funds in. So
That's right.
that's that's incredible. Thank you for that. I never even my father had left the camps already by June or July of 1979. So he was the first one
Right.
into the camps, but then the first one out. Thank goodness. So he wasn't actually able to be around all of this, but many of our listeners still had parents in those
Yeah.
camps at those times. So it's
Yeah.
really wonderful to have this kind of
Yeah. It's
perspective.
uh, this was the period of the mass exodus out of Cambodia. And for a while, these camps were like the second largest cities of Cambodians. They weren't in Cambodia, but Khao Dong had, I think, 150,000 people
Right.
at its height. There were ad hoc camps along the border, which had probably tens of thousands, maybe 100,000. I haven't talked about them because south of Aranya Patet, this Thai border town, was Khmer Rouge territory on the Cambodian side.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who came out there were under the control of the Cambodians. But they were kind of an exception because in most of Cambodia, as the Vietnamese army came in and as it approached individual towns and communes and villages, the Khmer Rouge just kind of melted away and left everybody behind. And those people became free to do what they wanted. They well, they were left to fend for themselves, and they had to find food. They could go looking for family members, and they could travel. And so north of Aranya Patet were these stretches of the border where people came on their own volition. And they walked there, they came by bicycle, they came by ox cart, and they crossed into what they thought was Thailand. Nobody could quite say where did Cambodia end and where did Thailand begin.
Mm-hmm.
And just on their own, they set up these huge ad hoc settlements. And just waited to see what would happen next. And at first, they were entirely on their own. Some people brought gold that they had dug up from their backyards, gold that they had buried in 1975. They brought it to the border and they used it for barter trade with Thais who would literally walk into these places with knapsacks full of basic supplies and charge them an arm and a leg. It was outrageous.
The black market is
Black market,
what you
right?
witnessed. Yeah.
But the first time I saw that was a similar kind of situation where I described with those Khmer Rouge soldiers. We were driving along a border road north of Aranya Patet, and I was with another journalist friend, a man named Michael Batty of the Reuters news agency. And we decided, let's just stop here and walk to the border and see what we see.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just started walking along these, rice paddy dikes. And first there was no one. And then, oh, there's a person over there. Who's that? And then we kept walking. And then there was a gunshot in the distance. And then we kept walking and, oh, there's 20 people. And we kept walking. And soon we were in the middle of an encampment of 1,000 people, all of whom were just camped out under, if they were lucky, they had some blue plastic sheeting, with which they had put up a shelter with, sticks cut from the trees, and terrible conditions. I can't tell you how bad the sanitation was.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people terribly sick, but here there was a form of personal freedom in that they weren't under the control of the Khmer Rouge. There were these, again, ad hoc groups that were known as the Khmer Seri, the Free Khmer, who were, each camp had its own commander who might be feuding with the commander of the next camp. But they did not insist on this social organization the way the Khmer Rouge did.
And these
So, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just had a quick question. So these ad hoc camps didn't have the attention of the UN or the organizations because they were
It,
just
it,
kind of grew naturally on their own.
they grew naturally.
Okay.
They were organic, we would
Organic.
say these days.
Yeah.
They just sprang up, and early on there was no NGO, foreign aid support. But that particular camp that I was talking about earlier was known for reasons we never discovered as 007. And as 007 became known back in Bangkok and various places, NGOs started going to the place, and they actually built a road uh, to run, I don't know, the half mile or whatever it was from an existing Thai road. They just cut a road through the through the forest to reach this place. And then, after a while, there were clinics, there were feeding programs, there were the handing out of basic supplies, wells were being dug, basic amenities were being provided, and there was still this steady flow of people arriving again on their own from the Cambodian hinterland. And sometime late in 1979, the UN succeeded in convincing uh, the Thais to allow them to open Khao Dang, which was 20 miles away. And buses would come in on this new road, and people who wanted to go would get on the bus and then go to Khao Dang, where things were considerably more comfortable, more civilized, and safer, because these Khmer Seri groups every now and then would start shooting at each other. There was always the fight to control territory and fight to control relief supplies. Often, if you wanted to distribute relief supplies in a place like 007, you had to have an accommodation with that local commander.
Mm-hmm.
And the local commander had all sorts of delusions of grandeur, and he would talk about how we're going to attack the Vietnamese and we're going to drive them out of Cambodia. And this guy over here, he's the new Minister of Health, and this guy over here is the new Minister of Transportation. But if you wanted to distribute aid goods, you had to deal with this guy and maybe give him a cut of what you were going to hand out, or there would be some fiction that we're going to leave these supplies here, and mind you, they must not go to soldiers. They're only for civilians. Oh, don't worry, they'll all go to civilians. But you can imagine what would happen.
So generally the commanders of these organic camps that would kind of pop up along the border, were they, from what you're understanding, were they Khmer Rouge soldiers? Or
no, they were not Khmer Rouge soldiers. A lot of them had been soldiers in the army of Lon Nol, the leader of the Cambodian government from 1970 to 75.
Okay.
So they were people who were separate from the Khmer Rouge, but like the Khmer Rouge, they were very anti-Vietnamese and saw the Vietnamese as having invaded and occupied their country. And they would wear fatigue uniforms, and they had guns. So someone was supplying them with weapons, and they had sort of an uneasy relationship with. You go a mile or two up the border, and there might be a Khmer Rouge camp there, and so there was always this uneasy relationship between these Khmer Seri, free Khmers, and the Khmer Rouge. Generally, it was thought that the Khmer Rouge were much more capable as actual soldiers for actually confronting the Vietnamese than were these guys, who often could seem more interested in making money and lording it over refugees.
Right. No, I think that's a great point to bring up, to talk about how did these camps really come up to be, because there were thousands, from what I understand, or hundreds at least, of these camps that were that were organic and not just the main ones that had the attention of the UN and all the organizations, because everybody was flooding out of the country. I mean,
that's right.
So they were somewhere. Yeah.
They were somewhere. And 007 was right at the site of a 1,000-year-old Khmer temple. The ruins of a Khmer temple dating from the great Khmer Empire, which built Angkor Wat and all those amazing things near Siem Reap town in Cambodia. And I always wondered, and I could never get an explanation as to whether the presence of that temple was what drew Cambodians to that particular place on the border. But it did draw them.
Yeah.
There was you just could not believe your eyes when you went in and saw how many people were camped out in this place.
So, John, I wanted to also touch upon this point that you had mentioned before our recording, was that you actually went back to the cities, Cambodian cities, for example, Phnom Penh and Battambang, I believe, and was able to see what was left of these cities during this time too, after the Cambodians have all been pushed out of, after the Khmer Rouge, and they're all along these borders of Thailand, and going back to the actual cities. What did you witness when you went back?
Yeah. Well, all during this period that I'm talking about, it was basically not possible to get access to inside Cambodia, and so we would go to the border and interview refugees. What's going on in this town? What's going on in that town? What was your experience? The government that the Vietnamese had installed in Phnom Penh was under international boycott. Nobody outside of the Soviet bloc countries, so Soviet Union, East Germany, Romania, places like that, Cuba, nobody was recognizing that government in Phnom Penh. And that meant there, no American embassy, no British embassy, no formal relations. But in April of 1980, I got an invitation from this new government saying, you have our permission to come in and be a reporter and write stories, and so I jumped at it, as would anyone. And the only way to get there is I actually flew in on a UN airplane that was delivering relief supplies, because there was no commercial service between Thailand and Cambodia. So I had 2 weeks, a week in Phnom Penh, and then a week on the road driving around the Tonle Sap, the Great Lake of Cambodia. And talk about another mind-blowing experience. At the border, you got the feeling that the whole population of Cambodia had crossed into Thailand, and you imagine Phnom Penh as being kind of a ghost town still, as it was during the Khmer Rouge. But Phnom Penh was a humming hive of activity, with outdoor markets, with crowded streets, thousands of people living there under very difficult conditions. No running water, no public electricity, no banks, none of the things that we take for granted as the services that you would get in a city. So I was there, and I was invited by the government, and they assigned me a guy from the information ministry who would go around and be my interpreter. And there were things that they wanted me to see, and they wanted me to see the crimes of the Khmer Rouge, which evidence was everywhere. And they wanted me to see, a newly restarted school, a newly restarted factory, to send the message out that we are fully in control, and under us, Cambodia is recovering. But then in the afternoon, this guy would go home, and I was basically free to just walk around and talk to whomever I could talk to. And so I spent a lot of time just walking around the center of Phnom Penh and poking in here, poking in there. There were a few places I couldn't go, Vietnamese military camps. Nope, you can't go in there, that's for sure. But people would approach me, and we would try to communicate, and I sort of got a feeling for what was the life of the city, to the extent I could, without being able to have deep, in-depth conversations, witnessing with my own eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Then we did a week. They provided me with a car, a Soviet-built Lada sedan, and with this interpreter and a driver, we got in the car and we drove first to Siem Reap, the site of the Angkor temples, and drove through these scenes of just unbelievable devastation. It was almost like nothing had been rebuilt from the 1970 to 75 war. The highways were in terrible conditions, huge potholes, or in places the whole road is collapsed. But again, a lot of activity. Bicycle traders, these were guys who would ride their bicycles to the Thai border, load up with stuff, and then ride their bicycles all the way back to Phnom Penh and sell these things in the market. So we were almost never alone on this road. There were always people in the villages along it, or these bicycle traders. And so we spent a day at Angkor and got a tour of the temples with the newly appointed conservator. And I may have mentioned to you that Angkor is one of my favorite subjects about Cambodia, and I've written a number of books about that. But it was just an amazing sight to see Angkor had been basically off limits for 10 years. Mm-hmm. And there was all this question about what had happened to Angkor in those 10 years. And happily, the main answer was neglect. There wasn't any sort of war damage, significant war damage to these places. And as I said, everywhere we came across, signs of the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. And as a journalist, you're always trying to sort of get away from your government minder. And one day we were driving along and I said, let's just stop at this village right here and see what we see. And we stopped at the village and got out and talking to people there. And very soon he says, well, I suppose you'll want to see the mass grave. And so they led us a few hundred yards out of the village, and there was a mass grave. Wow. Of bones poking through the soil. And this was one of the main messages that this government wanted to deliver, that Cambodia was under the under control of a gang of terrible criminals and mass murderers, and the new government liberated people from that. And here we just stopped at one village selected randomly and found that it had its own mass grave just on the outskirts of it. So we were a night in Siem Reap, then a night in Battambang, mm-hmm. And another question that I was trying to cover in this period was what was happening to the international food shipments that were going into Phnom Penh. Mm-hmm. Because there was a parallel effort. On the one hand, food was being shipped to the Thai-Cambodian border from the Thai side, and the parallel effort flew it and brought it by ship into Cambodia itself. And the question is, what was happening to that rice and that food? Was it being distributed? Was it being turned into a political weapon in which you reward people for loyalty to the new government? And I sort of found a mixed, a mixed response. We stopped at villages where people would say, no, nobody has brought us anything here. And then there were other places where they did seem to have received a shipment. So From Battambang, we drove back to Phnom Penh, and I flew back to Bangkok on another aid flight later on, and then uh, there was basically no communication, so I didn't file a word for 2 weeks when I was inside because literally there was no way. There was no way to, and
Right.
so I wrote all my articles after getting out, and in some it was kind of an inspiring experience in that people were all doing what it took to get on with their lives. And in places there were people were in really really high spirits. They weren't depressed. They were happy to be on their own and making their ways as best they could. So the bicycle traders in particular were very impressive people to me because they were riding these rickety old rusty things and riding them like 200 miles to get from Phnom Penh to the border, and then riding them back. And there's a limit to how much you could carry on the back of a bicycle,
Right.
but they managed. So
What a wonderful representation of just of a rebirth and of
yeah,
continuing to move forward regardless of what had happened in the past. And it we will start from scratch. We'll start from a bicycle. We'll just put as much as we can on here and we'll continue.
yeah.
So, John, what was the overall biggest lesson that you'd learned from this entire experience, would you say?
Mm. Well, I would say up until then, I had never known that we shouldn't take for granted the peace and prosperity and order that we have in this country and so many countries of the world, and that every now in the history of humankind there are these terrible tragic interludes where all of these things go out the window and people are forced onto survival mode. I hadn't, I'd read about that, but I hadn't really appreciated it until I saw it with my own eyes, and I hadn't appreciated, how much I and my family and most of the people in this country
Right.
have as a result of that. I would say that was the big takeaway for me. But I I would be. I don't want to oversell my humanitarian credentials here in that I also viewed this whole episode as a fascinating time of journalism, to be there, to be witnessing it, and to be writing it down, and to sort of making a record of it for whomever comes next.
Well, I think I speak for all my listeners when I say thank you so much, John, for
Oh,
your
you're
work
very welcome.
during this time. We needed those journalists to come and really get into the core of what the heck was happening. Because if it wasn't for the fact of people there taking these stories and going down that dark path to really understand and learn what was going on, and sharing that with the world, then people don't know. People just don't know what is going on, and your efforts are definitely needed. So
Okay. Well,
I
thank you.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much for this time and chatting and sitting with me. And I'm sure our listeners can get so much value out of hearing what you have to say. If for people who you had mentioned you had written several books about Angkor Wat, and also the articles. I will be posting for everybody a list of the articles that John had written during this time period, so you can check it out. But for people who want to learn more about you, John, is there a hub or some place that people can find you and your work?
Yes. Well, my website is www.john-burgess.net, and it's JOHN.BURGESS.net, and you'll see links to my books there, and you can also go on Amazon, and if you just search for John Burgess Cambodia, my author's page will come up.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for the time and sitting down with us. For anyone who wants to check him out, please do. And yes, thank you so much again for your time.
Okay, you're very welcome.
How cool was that? Seriously. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I loved how we touched upon so many different things, from just his perspective about the dynamics of the different people who were there between the Thais and the organizations and the refugees, to him witnessing the march of bunch of Cambodian refugees flooding out of their own country, to the day of First Lady Carter's visit. There's so many just different angles to this that I think people can pull from. And I think it also just kind of makes it all the more real for other people who weren't actually there to live through it. Next episode, next week, we are going to actually kick off with one more guest before we get to Robert. He was a volunteer, a field representative on the camps, helping the doctors, helping the nurses, attending to the refugees. And he did this for a total of 2 years. So I thought that he definitely had to come on the podcast because he can actually speak to what life truly was like living in the camps on a day-to-day basis. And I think this part of it is just so important because, again, this is the part on top of many parts that our parents don't really open up and discuss about. What life was like in the camps. And everybody had a different experience. There were so many different border camps that were popping up. Either it was organically or by the organizations. And each and every one of them had different support systems, different resources. And not every refugee really had gotten attended to, depending on which one you were staying at. So I wanted to bring more perspective on what life truly was like before the Cambodian refugees got shipped off to these third countries. And this guy next week is going to be the perfect man to kind of cater to that side of the story. So I'm excited for next week's episode. Stay tuned, guys. I hope you guys are enjoying this. And in 2 weeks after next week's episode, we will return to Robert's story. Thanks for listening in, and I'll catch you guys next week.